You recording? Great. Welcome everyone to another edition of the Orange Vale History Project membership. Well, we call it the membership meeting, but everyone is welcome. We are doing a lot of exciting things right now, which we'll get into in the business meeting right after the presentation. Right now, I'll focus on presenting on our biography for this month, which is Andy Pickles. Exciting, a lot of good research here, a lot of fun. And then we will, of course, get into our business. We have a lot of exciting updates during our business meeting afterwards, so don't go anywhere because we have some crazy stuff going on, let me tell you. Annie Pickles, Profiles in the Vale. She was quite the character and was somebody who added some flavor to Orange Vale. And so I'll go over, in some of our presentations, we've gone over the house, and then we'll kind of touch on some of the people. This will be going over her life, and then we'll be hitting some events and some things in Orange Vale as we go through, add some extra spice and flavor as we go along through the information. So first thing, early life. We'll talk about where she was born and whatnot, talk about that part there. Heading to California. She didn't originally come from California. We'll get that covered. The Alaskan adventure, which was quite a kick to find. Finally settling in the Vale, where we get involved with Annie. And then she ended up going out to pasture somewhere else, decided not to retire in the Vale, so we'll cover that as well. Her early life, she was born in 1860, so right at the beginning of the Civil War in Ohio. And the family was mostly in St. Louis, Missouri, but we start our talk with her showing up on a census report, I think at 5 months old in 1860 in Ohio with her family. And her family included 2 older brothers and a younger sister. The parents were originally born in England based on the census information. So it was all good info that came out of Ancestry, which is one of the great resources, which is free. Bruce left already. So Bruce was here from the Orange Vale Library across the street. He checked out our mobile history encounter, which is in the back corner. It will be at the library on the 18th. So our public will be able to enjoy it. But he came over to check it out before it came over there, and decided to share it with him. But we have the Ancestry available through the library for free. So if you have your library card, you can get to Ancestry. You can't have an account and you can't do all your Ancestry stuff, but you can look through all the information that's there, which is a really nice resource from the library, as well as the California newspapers are free there and other resources. So don't forget to check out your local library. Okay. Got my little plug in there. All right, so they moved to St. Louis, Missouri between 1865 and 1873. So we have 1865, I've got a hit in Ohio. And then in 1873, the information we have is her father died in 1873, and he died in St. Louis. So that's how we figured out they had moved from Ohio back to St. Louis. Originally, they were in St. Louis before she was born for a bit of time, but they did move back after the Civil War. So most likely, once the Civil War ended, for some reason they decided to go back to St. Louis and continue raising the kids there. So she was 13 when her father died, and they were hanging out there. We have work starting up for her, so she had a couple things showing up on the radar as we're digging through newspaper clippings and different information. The first one is she appeared in the St. Louis City Directory in 1883, and she was working as a bookkeeper. So at this point, she was 23 years old, working as a bookkeeper at a local business. She still had the same address as her mother and her sister, still living at home. And that house, I looked for it, it's been plowed under. So St. Louis progressed just like Orangeville does in a lot of cases. But they were living in that house, and then the 2 older brothers had moved out, and they had their own addresses in the directory, so I could see them there listed with all the other Pickles, just a big page of Pickles, and they were still in the area. That's another reason I love doing this bio. Annie Pickles, come on. I just needed a little eye candy. So up the top right corner, you have the city of St. Louis. This is one of the river boats that did transportation and whatnot along the Mississippi River during the time that they lived in St. Louis. So I was like, oh, we'll get a picture this is from 1888, a picture of the city of St. Louis, which was the name of this particular boat. Well, let's get out of St. Louis. Let's head to California. Pickles headed to the bay, the city by the bay. She saw promising things there. The reason we know she moved, because as doing research and digging through all this stuff, her name pops up in the Oakland, San Francisco Bay Area. And so we will head into the bay. We have her showing up in around 1888 in the San Francisco, Oakland area. And with the newspaper clippings, the first hit we have is in 1889. She's purchasing a piece of land in Oakland, potentially to build a house, but for $10. She got a really good deal on a little patch of land in Oakland. When I looked up the location based on the description here with the East 12th Street, Northeast, 60 feet by 120 feet, it's just a little bit southwest of the lake. I don't know if anybody knows where the lake is in Oakland.
Like Merritt?
Yeah. So it's just southeast of there, and there's just other buildings there now, but she had originally just built or bought the lot. And so it seems like she was perhaps thinking about building a house, not sure, but she was living in some other house in Oakland at the time. And we see that through the San Francisco City Directory. So she shows up with the residents in Oakland. It was interesting how it was descriptive. So she's in the San Francisco Directory as Annie Pickles. So she's employed in San Francisco, so that's why they put her in the directory. But they specifically said she resided in Oakland. So she's commuting, supposedly be going across on a boat, across on the ferry between Oakland and San Francisco to go to her employment. And in this case, she was in San Francisco with the Southern Pacific Railroad as a stenographer. A pretty good job. So shorthand, stenographer. They actually make pretty decent money these days as well. Back then, that was a very good skill to have. And she was being used for 11, 12 years as she worked for the railroad there in San Francisco, and apparently made a decent amount of money and was able to do a bit of investing, as we'll find out. And the other bit of information we had was we have a year 1900 St. Louis article that talks about Annie. We'll get to that later, but it mentions that she had moved to California 12 years prior, which would put us in 1888. Those are all those clues we put together to try to figure out, okay, when did she actually move between here and here? All right, out to the Alaskan adventure. Very exciting. This is a picture of Nome, Alaska in 1900. This, as you can see, there's not a town. It's a town of tents. And there are, as far as I can see, right? You see tents all the way down the shoreline. And in 1900, in Nome, Alaska, that's 2 years after they discovered gold there. The Klondike strike had already happened previously in Alaska, so people knew there was gold in Alaska. But there were some gentlemen that found gold in a creek here in Nome, Alaska in 1898. And by the time the word got out and things built up, 1900 was a big year for Nome, Alaska. Everybody was trying to get up there, including Annie Pickles. Yeah. So Annie Pickles is off for Cape Nome. We have an article in the Alameda Argus. I don't know many newspapers that are named the Alameda Argus. Does anybody know what Argus stands for? I didn't even look it up. No, okay. I'll have to look it up at some point, Argus. But that was the paper in Alameda, and she made it in two papers actually for this decision to go on this trip up north. She made it into the Alameda Argus and also into the Examiner, and they talked about her making this trip. But this particular article is kind of funny. They're talking about Annie Pickles just quitting her job, going to head up to Alaska. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but the employers were getting a little worried because there were people like just picking up and heading up to the gold to try to strike it rich. Yes, George?
Yeah, well, word just in from Wikipedia. Argus was a Greek god who had 100 eyeballs in his head.
Oh, Argus is a Greek god that had, or was a Greek god, or
It was a character in Greek mythology.
character in Greek mythology with how many eyeballs?
It says about 100 eyes on his body, means all-seeing.
Okay, all-seeing, 100 eyes on the body, Argus. So Alameda Argus, the big eyeball newspaper. All right, that's a good deal. Thank you, George. So she was heading up to Nome, Alaska, and you'd think, well, is she going out for the gold? No, she's not. So she's going up there. She talks about making her fortune as a clever shorthand writer in the mining city of Nome. So as people did in Sacramento, with the California Gold Rush, most of the people that made a bunch of money, they weren't the miners, right? They were the people doing supplying, and they had the stores, and they had the Levi's, and they had all the materials the miners needed. Well, Annie was thinking about that and going, you know what? There's going to be a lot of litigation up there. Claims, jumping claims. Going to be a lot of people trying to keep track of their businesses, and they're going to need people like me to do shorthand and stenography and all that stuff. So she was heading up there to make a good bunch of money with all the demands for the gold rush. So she was thinking about that. Anyway, her employer was a little worried, and they were hoping she wouldn't strike it rich, because they were expecting all the other employees to be on the next boat up there if Annie made it well. So, but they still gave her a nice farewell. They gave her a gold watch and a clasp, and gave a little speech for her, said thank you for your employment for the last 11, 12 years. And Mr. McCabe, who was her employer, he was actually taking care of her canary. So her canary, typewriter, and her sewing machine stayed with Mr. McCabe while she went up to Nome, Alaska to try out her chance at fortune. So she's heading north, and I didn't know where Nome, Alaska was until I looked at the map, and I was like, wow, that's very far north. So the red dot there is Nome, Alaska. And so you're up almost to the Bering Straits, very high up, and very cold, yes. The green one, I believe, is the Klondike strike. So the two routes to Nome were either overland and over the river through Alaska, or you went by boat over the ocean, hoping for ice to be melted before you got up to that part of the north. So pretty crazy adventure. The steamer came out of San Francisco. It went up to Seattle. They had over 100 passengers, and they picked up a bunch more in Seattle. So they had partial passengers in San Francisco and Seattle. They loaded up to max, and they headed all the way up there. Well, on her journey, and while she was in Nome, she wrote a letter. And she wrote a letter to her sister-in-law. So while she was traveling on the boat and had some time, she was talking about the different people on the boat and what was going on, and the ice they ran into, and they were stuck in the ice for a while, because this was in, what did I say, that was May, right? May in 1900, she's getting on the boat. And then you're headed up to a very high point in Alaska. So they hit ice, and they were stuck in the ice for a while until a icebreaker came along and broke them through and got them up to Nome, Alaska. So she talked about that bit of adventure. She met some nice people on the boat. They had plenty of time to chat and walk around, and she did a little bit of work for some folks on the boat in the way of shorthand and stenography. So she kept herself busy. And this was the other article from the Examiner. There were 8 women on this boat she was on. There were over 200 men, 8 women. One of them, of course, was Annie Pickles. One was a singer, an entertainer. Apparently she was going to head up to the saloons and make some money singing. And I'm not sure what the other 6 were going up for. But you can all make conjecture on that if you like. Goldfields tend to bring a lot of different people up to those areas. So yeah, when she sent the letter to her sister-in-law in St. Louis, Missouri, her sister-in-law decided to share it with the local paper. And that's why we have access to it. Very exciting. I was looking for her in California, and then all of a sudden I get a hit in Missouri in 1900. And this picture right here is Annie Pickles in that newspaper. She got a whole half page in the newspaper with her letter, and as well as some credentials, and a little blurb from her sister-in-law and her friends, because guess what? They had to, I guess, give her some credibility as a single source and a single woman running off into Alaska. What are people going to think? Are they going to believe this story? So yes, Mrs. Pickles, who moved to California from St. Louis, is well educated, and her friends say her report can be relied upon as authentic. So that was in the headline above the letter. So they were trying to make sure people believed this story from Annie. And so she talked about there were people on the boat had paid for their way up to Nome, and they didn't have enough money to get back. No return fare. So she was running into quite a few people in Nome that were not making it very well there for her months that she was there, and they didn't have any way to get home. And that's a pretty cold place to be sitting in a tent through the next winter. So there was she was definitely commenting on that. She had, of course, planned ahead. She had fare to go back. And once she saw the conditions and that there was no judge on site, it was still a territory, there was no judge there for the season, so there was no litigation going on. There was nothing for her to do. So she quickly decided to head back to California. So she's back in California by January of 1901. So very quick trip, probably got out of there before the ice started settling in, and that was probably a very good choice to get back to somewhere a little bit warmer. And guess what? That new warmer place was Orange Vale. That's right, settling in the Vale. On the Vale timeline, this is an interesting part. She was an investor, and she planned ahead. So we're going to go back in time to circle back to her Orange Vale start, and that begins with her buying early. She bought the first parcel. She was the first buyer of the tract she bought, and she bought it 4 years after the colony came into existence. So very early buyer, Annie Pickles, Miss Annie Pickles, by the way. So she saved up enough money doing her work in San Francisco to purchase one 10-acre tract, and 2 years later, she purchased a second. She had 20 acres in Orange Vale. So in 1892 and 1894, the Orange Vale Colonization Company, she bought it. She's the first one to buy it. Whenever the deed goes from Orange Vale Colonization Company straight to the people, you know that's our first purchaser. And 244 and 273, we will take a look and see where those are at in Orangevale here in a second. But she did visit, as we saw in the timeline, right? She was working in San Francisco, living in Oakland during the 1890s, and then she went to the Nome Goldfields in 1900. Well, she purchased in 1892 and she visited. So she was working in San Francisco. She visited Orangevale to check out what was going on. And they had a nice article about her. They were trying to drum up, additional buyers in the tracts, and we've got a single gal making an investment in an agricultural community. And so they put her up at the villa. So she's hanging out at the villa, and she came down to check out her holdings. And she is mentioned, of course, that she worked for the railroads in San Francisco. So she's coming from one of the big towns in the area. So she was very impressed with how it was being managed. She had them managing her two parcels. At this time, she only had one parcel, but she visited several times, and she, of course, bought the second parcel in 94. But she was impressed with how they were doing it and gave them a nice review on Yelp. And this is how they were trying to impress everybody else that, hey, you should buy here. You got really smart people buying in the colony, and she's looking to erect a building upon her tract and contemplates becoming a settler in the colony before long. Of course, this is in 92, so it did take a few years. One of the things we are missing is the building information, like when the house was built. I can't find anything about, they're building Annie's house, or they built the house on tract such and such. I can't find any information about when the house was built, but she's living in it in 1901. So it would have been built sometime between 1894, when she bought the second tract, because that's where it's at, and 1901. All right, I was hoping, Ralph is not here, is he? I don't see Ralph. Okay, Ralph from the Fair Oaks Historical Society. He found, I didn't know where this came from. So this brochure for Orange Vale, there's a digital version, PDF, on the Fair Oaks Historical Society's website. The Chamber also has a copy of it, I think, from Fair Oaks. And I didn't know where it came from, like the source, who, because they don't have this downtown. I didn't know where it came from until I talked to Ralph at their last meeting where I spoke to the Fair Oaks Historical Society. He's like, yeah, I found that at a garage sale or something. He found it somewhere, and he owns the original copy of this. And they scanned it at Fair Oaks and made it available on their website. So it's a very useful, we use it a lot. This piece of material includes a lot of good details about the early colony. And one of those details is some of the purchasers of the tracts. So they were promoting all these wonderful people from all over the country, California, that were buying tracts in Orange Vale. And if you look at this, there's 2 pages of this. So this is the Sacramento folks, the San Francisco folks, and then they go into other states and international, Canada. We had some folks from Canada that purchased tracts. But just on this section, I counted them up. There's 53 total names, and of those 53, 11 are female. And in 1894 or so is when this was published. That's pretty impressive to have that many females that are the owner of the tract and have been put on the contracts. So that was pretty cool. Never mind all the other folks, most likely have wives, so they're involved, but all the specific female names that I can count out was 11 in this case. So it's pretty neat. And of course, Annie Pickles is there as well with her 2 tracts. And since it says 2 tracts, that tells me this was published at least in 1894. That's when she got her second tract. So pretty neat to see her showing up out of San Francisco and being one of the early purchasers of tracts that they were promoting through their publishing arms. So glad we found these aerial photos. So somebody from the food bank turned us on to the UC Santa Barbara aerial database. And just in case Fair Oaks and Citrus Heights don't know, UC Santa Barbara aerials, they're free. They have a map, and they have dots on the map, and they're color coded. The darker the color red, or the darker the color, the older the photo. So the earliest photos I could find of Orange Vale, or pieces of Orange Vale, was 1928, and this is one of them. And thankfully, Annie's parcel happened to be on this photograph, so that was neat to find. If we go to the 1900 parcel map for Sacramento County, we have Annie Pickles showing up with her 2 tracts, 244 and 273. So we have 244 on the top side and 273 just south of it. And they're next to Cherry Avenue. Anybody know where Cherry Avenue is? Well, that's a different Cherry Avenue, Mary. Yeah, we had to change the name when the Cardwell Colony came in. So the 5th Street on the right there is Main Avenue. The middle street there is, on this parcel map, is Orange Vale Avenue, which became Greenback Lane. You have Walnut Avenue going through the middle there, and then Cherry became Chestnut. So we're looking at the corner of Chestnut and Greenback on the parcel map. Well, if you look at this aerial, let me just go back real quick here. For folks that are familiar with Orange Vale, the old Orange Vale, this curve right here is pretty famous. Whenever you see it on a map, it's really clear that that is the intersection of Main and Greenback. Because when the Lincoln Highway came through and the Orange Vale Bridge was built, so Orange Vale Bridge was built in 1915, we eventually got the Lincoln Highway, one of the segments coming through Orange Vale. But this particular curve right here at Main and Greenback is pretty diagnostic when you're looking at an aerial map. And you go, oh wow, yeah, that's Greenback and Main. So we know this is Greenback in Maine, right here. So this would make this Greenback. And you can see the little, these are the palm trees running along. So not only were they down by the Calder mansion and down by the Portwood mansion, down by Hazel, they were also all along Greenback further down in 1928. Now in our case, we're talking about Annie Pickles, who's there in 1901. So we have a few extra things here that might not have been there in 1901. So just think about that. One of those is the villa, which is right there on the map. Your Dairy Queen would be right here. And this is where Ovi Copy is now. But in 1901, the villa was still over on the bluffs. So that house was not there. But it's pretty close to what it was. Not much changed in 27 years from when Annie moved in. So let's look back at the parcel maps. We're at 244, 273. And that would put us right here with Chestnut on the far left side and then Greenback. Now what's interesting about this, most of the houses, you'll see them fairly close to the main road. So you got, well, this is that's Castleman's, the grocery store, which was eventually the Greenback Grocery, Greenback, I'm trying to remember the names. Greenback Market, thank you. And now is the Car Quest, I think, or yeah, so that's right there at Walnut. So that building was there early on, 1928. We have this house right here, which got torn down not too long ago. So we had the Wild Sports here on the corner, and vans and jets. This Victorian back here was parked back here for quite a while, and it just got torn down for storage, I don't know, in the last 30 years. So it was there for quite a while, hiding back behind Wild Sports. And actually, BJ had before and after pictures on the intersections on Orangevale Forever. And it was kind of cool to see the old Victorian hiding back there in the before and after pictures. So here we are. It's interesting. So they have these houses. They're all fairly close to the Greenback Lane. But Annie, where does she put her house? She puts it on the back parcel, way away from Greenback, and she also centered it on the parcel. It's almost like as far away as you could get from anybody. I thought that was very interesting. When I looked at the photo, I'm like, it's an interesting place to put a house. Now, if you were to go to that exact location today, it would be Swade Hill Court behind Chestwall. If the Palmers were here, I would let them know the Palmers, it's pretty much behind their backyard and behind my parents' backyard, actually, because they're on Garden Town. And so there's a little hill behind my parents, and Swade Hill Court's up on that knoll, and her house would have been right up on that hill behind my parents' house. So it's pretty cool. This is, but yeah, it was very interesting to see where she placed her house. And we'll see, because as I'm looking through this data and kind of analyzing, like, what's going on, what's this person like, what makes them tick? It's interesting to see all the different clues we have and then try to come up with some hypotheses about what's going on. So Annie makes history, very exciting. As soon as she hits the ground in Orangevale, she is acknowledged for her skills as a stenographer and shorthand, and she becomes the very first woman to be elected to the Orangevale Water Company board. Very cool accomplishment in 1901. Yeah, very, very exciting. She shows up on the plaque. We went to the Orangevale Water Company was it last week, Kay? Yeah. 4 weeks ago. Yeah, we took another close picture of the board of directors. This is the board of directors history for Orangevale, all of them. And got a picture of the 100-year anniversary as well as part of our research at the Orangevale Water Company. We are very thankful to Joe, look in the camera, thank you, Joe, for all the access to their photos, to their archives. And we got some more access last week to some of their photo albums they hadn't shown us yet. So that was neat. And there were a couple letters addressed to Annie Pickles in those albums, which is neat to see. Well, she has another part of history that Joe reminded us of. She was also the last woman to be elected to the Orangevale Water Company board. Now, I'm hoping that's not on Annie, I suspect it just is a coincidence, but she was there for about a year, and she left the board. I didn't see her on any more signatures after 1901. We have paperwork on her in 1901. She's signing, in fact, I'll show it here in a second. George has got something for us here. We have in 1901 in February, so she showed up in January in 1901 in Orange Vale. Next month, she's being elected to the board. So they were looking for her, or they were desperate. I'm not sure. They were like, oh, we need you. Her and William Calder were elected at the same time. He was president, and we have Mr. Landis was a vice president, Annie Pickles secretary, and then I believe the treasurer, I think, is Mr. Elkis. He had a store in Orange Vale as well. And we have her name up on that board in the Orange Vale Water Company. So she is stenciled there. I asked Joe if they had a picture of Annie. They do not, unfortunately. So the only picture we have of Annie is the one from the newspaper in St. Louis. Yes, but she made history in two ways. I was very surprised because Joe mentioned to us when we were there, he's like, she was also the last. We're like, oh wow, okay, well that's interesting. So life in the Vale. Now that she's settled here, we have the first article of her being in Orange Vale. It was January of 1901. We've got Jenny Sullivan from Seattle is a guest of Annie Pickles. So she's a guest, so she has a house. She has somebody visiting. Now from Seattle, that would make sense that maybe she met this gal in Seattle, because on our way back, she would have been back through Seattle. On our way up, she would have gone through Seattle. And so perhaps Jenny joined her on the boat ride back down to California and was hanging out with her. That's just based on how much time we have there and travel times and whatnot. That would be my theory, is she came down with her and hung out with her at her house in Orange Vale. And then in March of 1901, we have her doing some improvements. So she's putting in a barn and an outbuilding on her property. So it doesn't mention the house. So again, I have to assume the house is already there in this case. And I'm giving you all the newspaper clippings, by the way. This is interesting. We jumped to 2 years. So 2 years, quiet, nothing. Okay, 1903, all of a sudden, she's getting married. She's 43 years old at this point, and she is married some punk from Fair Oaks. I don't know why she didn't go to Folsom, but she's up for Fair Oaks. No. George Clark, he was one of the he came on one of the tours from back east to Fair Oaks when they first did the tours, and he bought early in Fair Oaks. So he bought in 1896, I think it was, so right when Fair Oaks was getting started, and he settled in Fair Oaks, and by 1903, he and Annie got together. I can't find any information about, like, they were both at a party, or they met here, or nothing. It's just, all of a sudden they're married. Whoa! All right, so yes, Miss Annie Pickles got married in 1903. And at this point, you have to change your searches, because she's no longer Miss Annie Pickles. Now she's showing up as Mrs. A.P. Clark, Annie Pickles Clark. Yeah, so I had to figure that one out, because you're like, okay, where did she go? I'm not finding pickles anymore. We've been pickled out. But we find her in 1906. This is, again, 3 years later. She starts advertising chickens, and she's selling eggs. And so we see some classifieds going on in the Folsom Telegraph from Mrs. A.P. Clark. And she's telling people to come over to Orange Vale to get your chickens and eggs and stuff. So no addresses, not at the corner of such and such. It's just Orange Vale. So you gotta, hitch up the wagons, cruise over there, and go, okay, where's Mrs. Clark's house? Oh yeah, she's just go down a couple more orchards, and then you head to the left, and once you go by the cows, it's pretty amazing. We didn't have addresses in Orangeville until I think the 50s. It's the first time I see street addresses in Orangeville. So whenever I see advertisements when we're doing the research, if somebody's trying to give them some direction, they'll say it's a mile north of this intersection, or it's a mile north of the store, that kind of stuff. You'll see those kind of directions given to people if they're trying to sell olives or whatever it happens to be. So it was very interesting. So she did do some advertising in 1906, but that was the only year. What's very interesting in this whole thing is, the Calders are here. The Calders having parties all the time. They're having bridge clubs, they're having get-togethers. We see lots of other groups in Orangevale getting together and having things. The church gatherings, there's all kinds of events. Linnell's grocery store, Castleman's actually had a room in it as well that could be used for events. And usually in the paper, if there was some kind of event, you'd have a list of the people who had attended, right? I'm not finding either of them in any of those social circles. So not only with the house way back from the road, I'm also not seeing her in the social circles. So that was a kind of interesting tidbit as you kind of noodle the different data points you're getting as you research these biographies. And then the final one here, she did go in 1906 to the California Fruit Growers Convention. So she did attend that in 1 year. I didn't see it again in any other year, but in that year she did attend it. I don't know if she was representing the area, because we did have representation from Orangevale, or if she went just for her own 20 acres, not sure, but she did show up on the radar there. So now we're out the pasture. We're done with Orangevale. She wanted to go to the coast. And it reminds me, because the original reason for her leaving St. Louis was for health reasons. She wanted to get to California, where the climate was better. You didn't have nasty snow and all kinds of stuff. So she did move to California originally for her health. And perhaps the coast was calling her again. She was in San Francisco and Oakland for quite a while. And so after 1908, they are selling their property. So here we are, tract 244 and tract 273 are being sold to Joseph Dodd from Annie P. Clark and G.M. Clark. So they're still together, that's good. And they're selling their property here locally. So they're on their way. We have her taking her departure for Monterey. It's going to be her future home. This is in January of 1909. And then in 1910, they actually brought some folks they knew from Orangevale to come build their house in Monterey. So Mr. and Mrs. Ellsworth Pierce, they returned from Monterey, where they had been for over 2 months, during which time Mr. Pierce built an 8-room cottage. That's not a small cottage, for Mrs. A.P. Clark, formerly of Orangevale. So she still had a connection with Orangevale when I guess decided there were no good builders in Monterey. I'm not sure why, but actually brought Mr. Pierce over to build the house, their retirement home in Monterey. So yes, Annie Pickles, she passed away in 1935, no children. The probate court, it went to her younger sister, so her younger sister actually moved to the Monterey area. I think her name was Shelley, if I remember right. But no children, no offspring to pass things off to. She was 75 years old, and she did at one point in the time between 1910 and 1935, she did come back and visit Orangevale, and she did talk about returning to Orangevale. So she did still have a little bit of a heart for Orangevale, even in 1913, and talked about perhaps coming back and hanging out in Orangevale for her last years, but that didn't happen. She ended up, we see the probate court showing up in 1935 and her passing in Monterey. So that is the story of Annie Pickles in Orangevale. So hope you enjoyed that, and we'll do some questions here after he turns off the video. David, thank you.